Testing audio. Test. Can people hear me on Zoom?
I can hear you.
So just turn the music all the way down. Just a little buzz. That's unfortunate.
Oh, I might need some water or something too. Do we have
Okay.
a glass of
Okay. I think we're about ready, and I don't know if you want to shut that off for a second, because we'll both be live technically.
Ooh.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, friends, for showing up. And sorry, a little bit late. We have this wonderful business that volunteers their space for us, and sometimes they have to also do business and not just service for the community. So we've got to kind of move things around a little bit, and that's great. And we do appreciate their business. They're a great company. They're as you can see, they're around us. They're a preparedness company that do a lot for the community, and so Food Storage Depot, we encourage everyone to support them just like they are supporting us and supporting Liberty. Now, I thought briefly before we get to Scott tonight, we're going to do the First Amendment as we're going through the Constitution. And he always gets excited when he tells me about, can I do my freedom of religion presentation? There's so much, and so he gets excited about that one. And so Bill of Rights, First Amendment, there it is, freedom of religion. And so the First Amendment itself might actually take a couple of classes because there's so many aspects to it in the context and the history. Okay, but briefly, to keep us sharp, we're learning the Constitution every month, and the goal of our classes is to find people across the country, locally and across the country, to use this information, okay, to use it to actually defend the Constitution in their communities. And we had a great testimonial last month of an actual scenario of someone who's been helped and applied it in their town to push back against the state abusing their constitutional authority. And so that's why we have our committee manual for those that want to put it into practice. And that's why we have Scott Bradley's Freedom's Rising Sun content to teach families this same content, to apply it and preserve it from generation to generation. So that is why we are here. Even if nobody ever cares about this country except for us, there's a few, but not that many more. We are preserving this knowledge so that someday more people will care. Okay, so being that we're preserving it, we're going to practice briefly. Okay, so as the only defense against the world is a thorough knowledge of it, let's think about the world and something happening in the world today in current events. How many have heard of the Corporate Transparency Act? Anyone? Okay. That makes sense. But there's actually a lot of people, this is on their minds in the business world. Because what is happening is in 2019, this law was passed. It took them about 5 years to write the regulations. And it's in this law says that if certain entities apply to form a corporation, they must file the beneficial ownership information with the federal government. So now it used to be, and it still is, a lot of people go to certain states because some states, they let you create an anonymous corporation, or at least they, not necessarily anonymous, but private, right? New Mexico, Wyoming, and there's different flavors in different states. Okay, and of course, under the Constitution, we have the right to contract, which we contract with friends or others to create an entity like a corporation sometimes, and there's different uses for that. But now the federal government is kind of saying, we want to no more of this nonsense of you having privacy, right? That's what they're trying to do, go down this road. So this act, the Corporate Transparency Act, at face value applies to corporations created under a state and limited liability companies created under a state. Now, I'm going to talk about on its face what it says, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Constitution, and then tell you some good news on that, kind of pros and cons. But this is about being sharp and applying the things we're learning. Okay, and then Scott may chime in too, I'm sure, because I actually had some questions for him when I was studying this. We didn't get to talk about it. Okay, but if it applies to those, then it doesn't apply to things like trusts or partnerships or sole proprietors or really any other kind of organization, especially private organizations. They've just listed it's to corporations and LLCs. You can actually read it in the US Code. uscode.house.gov is a good site to research that kind of things. But I ask you, those of us who love the Constitution, do you know, is it constitutional? And I didn't have the mic out, but what's a reason why it might not be constitutional? Can anyone?
It's the federal government invading, but it shouldn't invade. I mean, it's supposed to be a limited, federal government is a limited entity.
Okay, yep.
Really
So what you said was, I'm repeating for online, the federal government is going outside their bounds. They're limited, and this seems to be something outside what it was designed to do, right? That's a great answer. Any other reasons why it's unconstitutional? The government doesn't need to know our financial transactions. Well, they would argue they do need to know, right? And they have argued that in court. So here's a court case that's happened this year. Because this has actually become a high-profile situation for a lot of companies, 30 to 40 million corporations, the federal government says they're expecting to comply with this. And so there's been many court cases, and this was one, National Small Business Business United versus Yellen is the Treasury, Secretary of Treasury. Yep. And so has challenged. And thankfully, so far on the road to this being fully implemented, which right now 2 to 4 million entities have voluntarily complied. So you still got like 25 million or something like that, or right, that have not complied. It's going to take a long time. This is a big bureaucracy that's going to be involved here. But the courts have already ruled the Corporate Transparency Act is unconstitutional because it cannot be justified as an exercise of Congress's enumerated powers, which is exactly what you said, right? So that makes me feel good on its face a little bit, watching the news, and right? But there's kind of more to this. So it is now waiting for appeal. The government is appealing to the other government, the feds and the courts, to say, hey, but I ask you, does the appeal matter?
No, it's still unconstitutional.
Totally, right? Yeah, so the answers were no, because it's still unconstitutional. And of course, that's the point we have to remember as Americans. We don't want to sit and watch our TV like, oh no, am I going to have my rights or not, you know, and waiting for important people far away from us to decide if this is lawful or not. We already know if it's lawful because we, the people, wrote the law 200-300 years ago. We wrote the law, and we are the owners of the law. And as long as we understand the law and have done our due diligence, we can't be ignorant. We know if something's constitutional or not already. Okay, so other constitutional considerations besides enumerated powers that the courts did, First Amendment. This is actually, so in that court case, the complainant, let's see, the plaintiff, sorry. Yeah, thank you. The plaintiff made many arguments why it was unconstitutional. The court only ruled on one of them. Oh, it's not part of the enumerated powers. They just didn't really bring it. They didn't really talk about it, the other ones. At least that was my understanding. And so he didn't talk about his First Amendment concerns, but we should know, we the people should know the First Amendment concerns, because the way this ultimately doesn't take effect in our country is as many people understand it's unlawful as possible, because it is simply our compliance that makes it real at all times. Now, if we are ignorant of why we don't have to comply, then we cannot defend it and they can enforce it. But if we by the millions, or even just by the hundreds, and we share it around with enough key people, then it will not take effect because people know the law. So First Amendment is a concern. The Fourth Amendment, you talked about they don't need to know our information. So the Fourth Amendment says you need a warrant if you want anything about me. I have a right to privacy in my person's papers and effects. Fifth Amendment, not to testify against yourself. So if the regulators come and they say, hey, you haven't registered, you know, well, I'll be happy to comply with all lawful orders, Mr. Benevolent Officer, sir. Can you explain to me, will this information ever be used against me? Well, it could be. Well, okay, so you're asking me to testify against myself, right? So these are all constitutional concerns that when it becomes second nature to who we are as a people, these things can't take root. And so part of the jobs of us as individuals and as committees for the few committees we have across the nation that are trying to follow this is to teach your communities those very things. Okay, another thing is the state jurisdiction. Okay, so the law actually says under the law of a state or Indian tribe. Why is this entity called the United States? I mean, would Wyoming write a law that says Arizona has to do something? They're totally different boundaries and jurisdictions and entities. So here's the 48, at least, of the 50 United States. You can see the lines where they belong, and right, Texas isn't going to write a law for California. So why is this entity, 10 square miles, creating a law saying they can govern in the states? There is a state jurisdiction boundary there, which the court actually agreed. They mentioned, and I'm going to give you some quotes there, and then we'll move on to Scott here shortly. But always consider the answer to constitutional violations is nullification. So any of the, remember this from the solutions training that we have, any of these boundaries can be nullified across. So the state can say no to the feds, and in this case, it was a horizontal nullification. The courts in a state actually said, no, you cannot enforce this on the plaintiff, and was ruled and protected on that one. Okay, but in our view, what do you do when no government will do the right thing? Here we kind of see at least the court did partially the right thing. There's more coming though. But we also have, you know, why we talk about local communities and us as the people can still nullify and enforce. So that is what the that is exactly what this is all about, is how you do that with the law behind you properly. Okay, some interesting things that my animation didn't come in the right order, but so Business Law Today was an online magazine. They talked about explaining what the court did, and so it's kind of interesting to see us apply our knowledge of the Constitution to how the world is talking about it. So when they say with respect to Congress's powers over foreign affairs and national security, I paused right there and I thought, what are Congress's powers over foreign affairs? You know, well, if you look at foreign in the Constitution, the only thing in there is regulate foreign or commerce with foreign nations, right? And then, but there is also like defense, national defense. So that's dealing with foreign nations, I guess. But what does this have to do with like me creating a corporation, right? Yeah, so they always say, you know, the defendants argued that the law is necessary in order to protect national security interests by enabling enforcement to counter money laundering and terrorist financing, right?
They already do that. They already money laundering.
Well, that's the funny thing, is the money laundering is happening at the government level for the most part. And they're going to go after small mom and pop corporations to, you know, watch out for the scary boogeyman. That's always the excuse, right? There's always an enemy. If we don't have an enemy, government can't grow like it does. How many of you have seen that movie Wicked that's just come out? Okay, I would highly recommend it for a lot of reasons. And I love it when there's like truth in movies, even though I know it's Hollywood, right? But like, it's the backstory of The Wizard of Oz, if you guys haven't heard. And there's a part where a man in power just yells, you have to give the people an enemy. I'm paraphrasing, but he's saying you have to give them an enemy to unite them, right? And then that's how he holds on to his power. Well, this is a natural law Hollywood is just admitting to, that the enemies of liberty use all the time. Okay, another reason why it was unconstitutional is because of the, so the court rejected this argument, saying, among other things, that the congressional findings connecting the law to national security interests are not sufficient. Well, duh, right? So good. That was plain on its face. They also said regulation in a purely domestic arena of incorporation doesn't make sense. This is historically a state issue. So they recognize you're like the United States of, and where DC is like your territory and the territories and all that. Okay, they also talk about the Commerce Clause and things, but there's another case. There's actually been a lot of cases. And so all these other cases have kind of been put on hold because they're all the same. So thankfully, there's actually a firestorm to push back against this. Similarly, this reminds me of the National Defense Authorization Act, which actually the National ID, sorry, our National ID card that now they're going to say we need in airports to travel. That was supposed to go into effect in 2010. Because of pushback like this, they're 15 years later almost, and it's 80% implemented. So you can see this kind of pushback helps slow things down, but they're going to get their way in time. They're very patient, right? The enemies of liberty are. Okay, anyway, that was kind of the intro I had. Staying sharp for the Constitution as we gain a thorough knowledge of the world to defend against the evils of it. We'll turn the time over to Scott. And thanks, Scott, for letting me take a few moments there. I'll shut this down.
Oh, good thought. Okay, here's the deal. I'll just take a minute or two, or maybe 5. I don't know when you really want to end, but in regards to what Enoch was just talking about, 2 days ago, a federal judge in East Texas again put another stay on this, and it was immediately appealed to the Fifth Circuit, and so it's going to go through the courts. But the thing that you say resistance, they put a really high price of resistance on this. It's a $10,000 fine and 2 years in prison if you don't do it, and then $591 a day for every day of noncompliance. And so they're trying to put everybody's feet in the fire. And as Enoch has said, if we had 20 million businesses that said, ain't no way in over my dead body, it's going to be hard. This national ID that they put into, that they've been delayed over 15 years, Utah capitulated almost immediately. Utah rolled over, and if you've got a driver license, take it out and look at it, see if there's a star in the top right-hand corner. If you have registered or signed up for a driver license in recent years, there's a star there. Whether you knew it or not, you were saying it's okay to give them their ID. And all the time with these kind of things, I see in my mind, you've watched these old movies, Humphrey Bogart type movies, where there's the Gestapo or the Stasi or the KGB walking through the train. Papers. We're doing that right now, and they're doing bioidentifiers without telling you that with the TSA in your airports as you go through. Look into the thing. Oh, I got my picture taken. Yeah, I mean, it's just so nefarious. It's absolutely. I have this overwhelming urge when I go to the airport to snap my heels together and give a Nazi salute, Heil Hitler, to the blue shirts. It really is very much another unconstitutional invasion. But this thing that he's been speaking about, almost nobody knows about it. This registration that has to happen. I've gone in and looked at the forms, and they're innocuous enough, but you have to provide enough information, including sending your national ID. You have to take an image of that and forward it. So there's a whole bunch of things that are kind of snowballing to be able to build an image and to build the system. And so it's a nefarious, underhanded thing. There have been a few courts that have said, let's back off on this. But 3 weeks from now is when the deadline is for corporations, LLCs that were organized before January 1st, 2024. So anybody after that period of time has to, as you next year go in, you're supposed to send this in with your application. And it says it's anybody that has registered their account or their entity, if you will, with their state. And so this idea, if it's private, there's a thought. But what it's going to ultimately do, and this was what the Brits were trying to do in the 1760s and 1770s. So this was 250 years ago. The Brits said that anybody that's not doing business under our platform is now a black marketeer. And they were facing horrendous fines. You translate what the pound was then and so on. They were facing horrendous fines. There was this guy, you might have heard of him. He's got a big signature on the Declaration of Independence. His name's John Hancock. John Hancock was absolutely a black marketeer, according to the definition that the Brits were using at the time. And he kept getting caught. He got away a lot, obviously. Well, maybe not obviously, but until the straw broke the camel's back, and then they had to set up this thing called the Declaration of Independence. But that's kind of the path that we're on right now. And John Hancock was an early adopter of the rebellious approach. He wanted to say no well in advance. And he was a courageous guy. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a bold and intrepid freedom fighter. So this thing right now is poof, it's here. Suddenly, here it is. What is the 6th of December. We got 3 weeks to register, folks. Big fines, prison terms, big penalties every day we don't. I mean, they make it sound like, oh, ain't it awful? We're all going to die and we got to do this now. And so that's where this thing is going right now. But fortunately, there have been some courts intervene. They have stayed action. This federal court in Texas has stayed action on it. And it was instantly, like I say, appealed to the Fifth Circuit. And so they're going to take this to the mat. I would say one other well, there's a couple of other intervening things, you know. Some of you have heard of the Mac Prince Supreme Court decision about the Brady bill. Well, what the courts found was that the states cannot be ordered to do things by the federal government. And so the federal government had to come up with the Brady bill conformance thing where they call your name and number in and whether you can have a firearm or not. Okay, people wanted to define it very narrowly. All that has to do with buying a firearm, unless you're Hunter Biden. But at any rate, we won't go down that path right now because I'm already way behind time. But it could be looked at very broadly, where the court said, you know what, the feds can't order the states to do anything. If we had states that said, we ain't going to conform by sending you the documentation of XYZ LLC or whatever. So there's a lot of different levels that we can protect ourselves on. But if we don't understand the limits and bounds, it's a compliance thing. As Enoch was saying, we've already had a couple of million entities comply. You know, like I say, I went in and looked at the forms and everything like that, and they're not all that difficult to, but then you start saying, well, I got to take a picture of my driver license, and man, that's too hard for me. Anyway, whatever, and submit that. So there's going to be tons, probably millions of people that do not comply in the next 3 weeks. And right now, it is on hold, but it's being appealed, and we're going to see where this thing goes. But knowing what the constitutional process is, and understanding the limits and bounds on the national government, and this issue of the different levels of safety we have in this nation, they could save us if we'd start to know that thing. So that's probably way too brief a commentary on that. And Enoch, what time did you want to end? Well, did you want to end about 8:30-ish?
Got a little bit of a late start, so if you need a little more time, that's fine. That's probably enough.
Okay, we'll see. This is part one, as we can see on this.
But yeah, so if you can split it up into 2 parts.
I already have, and I'm going to probably have to spill some over until next week. Yeah. No, it's originally it was a trilogy, but before that was a prequel. Have you guys ever read? It's not just the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. There's the Silmarillion. And if you haven't read that, you still need to be educated. So, oh, and the Silmarillion, by the way, if you don't know 3 different languages, you're stuck. But Tamara read it with one of our young sons. How old was he? About 10? Anyway, he created a dictionary so you could cross-reference all the names and the genealogy and everything like that. Here's a 10-year-old doing that. You know, we homeschooled him, so he was smart enough to write. But oh, it is. But the Silmarillion is a magnificent document in regards to a lot of things that I think we see today, the evil that's out there and everything. Anyway, Tolkien was the same guy that wrote The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. Yep, Tolkien was a bright guy. He was an Oxford professor. Yeah, he was very much into. I tried to find a way of learning Old Anglo-Saxon, and there are no good courses unless I moved to Oxford. I couldn't do that. So anyway, I've gone to look for some other ones that are closest to that. There are the most identical language to the Old Norse is Icelandic. And so I've got an Icelandic course that I'm going to see, but I still won't know Old Norse. There's a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about that sometime if you're interested. I'm kind of a eclectic person that never does anything good or right. No, how would you say a jackass without calling him a jackass? But at any rate, let's go with this. Religious liberty, holy Hannah. Okay, there's a 3-part prequel to any of this 3-part. Religious liberty has been central, and the lack thereof has been central to the world's history. There's a horrific history behind this. And this nation ultimately and finally became a nation where this was possible, but it didn't happen immediately. But we're going to talk a little bit about it, beginning with the founding times of this nation. I'm not going to go back through Constantine and, you know, the Inquisitions and all this kind of stuff. I'm overburdened with how incessantly wicked has been this exercise of tyranny over the right to worship our God. And this was a big problem. So there's like about 5 hours in advance of the first part of this we could have done, but we're not going to. Okay, so here's what the First Amendment says. And by the way, I just want to parenthetically remark, there's a big misunderstanding by a lot of people, particularly within patriot groups. They say the First Amendment's first notice is religion. It's first for a reason. Well, it's nice that it is, but it isn't. The original 12 proposed amendments that went out to the states for ratification, First Amendment was the Third Amendment. The first 2 did not get ratified. Well, until 200 years later for one of them, but there's one still out there. But so this was not really the first of the first, but a lot of people believe a lot of things that are nice, kind of comforting folklore. But don't get caught in that. It is here, and we've got it now. But here's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now that last one is very twisted and perverse today also, and we'll talk about that at some point. But I'm not going to get off on that today because it's freedom of religion. But it is freedom of religion, not freedom from a religion. And we can worship according to the dictates of our own conscience without government intervention or interference. So we're going to discuss the things that led up to the creation of the First Amendment and the religious liberties protections. So we're going to look at the founders' words on this and give that consideration. Recently, I did a radio program wherein the idea was fostered that religious persecutions in Europe did not lead to people coming to America. That was a total falsehood. It was by somebody that should have known better and is very well known in the world of podcasts and commentary, okay? And he said, oh, no. Ha, the Pilgrims didn't come because of that. They had come, well, now he was partially right. They had spent almost 24 years in Holland before. Holland was a very open society. You could do almost anything you wanted. And they were there. They were practicing their religion all they wanted to and everything else like that. But the Pilgrims, they didn't want their kids to be assimilated into a secular society. So they got very nervous about that. Now, some other people today might be nervous about that with our children being assimilated into a secular society, because we'll find in a few minutes here, well, maybe an hour and a half, we'll find that the secular society we're in right now has a very, very powerful hold on religious instruction. You say, what the heck? We'll find out about that. But what happened was the Pilgrims were there. They said, no, we don't want our kids assimilated into a secular society. We're going back to England. and then we're getting out of town, because there was this guy in England, his name was James, King James Bible. Well, he's a nice guy, wasn't he? Absolute tyrant. He was a horrific leader, and religiously he was very, very. He was empowered. He was going to be in power. Okay, so anyway, we're not going to talk about all the problems the Pilgrims had and why so many of the wives died the first year and everything else like that. But the Pilgrims left from England to come here on this little wooden ship called the Mayflower. Now, we don't obviously have the original, but I've been on a replica of it built to scale, and I can't stand up down below in the hold, if you will, and they couldn't go on deck. Only the crew could go on deck. And so I'm hunched over when I'm down in there. They had little cubies they all lived in and everything, kind of like a cattle barn or a cattle car coming across on this little wooden ship that most of us wouldn't take on a nearby lake if we had a chance, especially if there might be a little wind. Anyway, so I have depicted here a ship that's of similar size and nature. And then there's little imagery of paperwork being signed there in the hold of the Mayflower. Now that was where they were signing the Mayflower Compact. We're going to read a bit of it in just a moment. They had come clear across, and they got there and they didn't want to lose track of why they'd come. And so they decided to try and document that, and then they were going to sign it. If I recall correctly, there were 29 men that signed it. But this was, I consider it the first American state paper. It wasn't a constitution, but it kind of was a paper of the stated purposes and so on. So here's the Mayflower Compact. We're not going to read the whole thing, just a couple of things here. They start with, "In the name of God, amen." A lot of us end our prayers with something similar to that. The reason they were doing that, they were bringing God into a compact, into a, if you will, kind of a covenant, okay? And then they talked about their dread sovereign Lord, King James, et cetera, et cetera. They had to do that or lose their head later. But at any rate, they say, "Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith." That was the principal reason they came to this land. And everything beyond that was overarched and undergirded by the hand of God and that intention, okay? So they sent, and these men signed this thing, and look what they did. Oh, by the way, let's go on here. "Solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid." So what they said before, the furtherance and advancement of the Christian faith, was the primary reason they were doing these things. It's interesting to me that they put their names 3 lines from the bottom, Cape Cod, 11th of November. Okay, that's the 11th of November. Now we do the Veterans Day, right? And remember, this was old style, so the date really is different, but because the English hadn't come over to the new style that Pope Gregory declared to try and bring calendars into conformance with the seasons again. But nonetheless, this is 11 November. I find that interesting that we could commemorate the signing of the Mayflower Compact in the old style dates. "The year of the reign of our sovereign Lord," blah, blah, blah. The 18th, "in Scotland, the 54th, Anno Domini," that's the year of our Lord, 1620. So these 29 men signed this document, and they were doing it, bringing God into the covenant to further the Christian faith. So there was just a handful of people. About half the wives were dead before spring, and a good number of the men. One of my ancestors was one of them. And so it was hard times. I mean, there was some really, really tough times. But between 1630, 10 years later, and 1640, about 20,000 of these guys called Puritans migrated to this country or this land. Now, Pilgrims and Puritans, there was some differences we won't need to split hairs on, but they were not the same people, okay? So there were thousands that came to enjoy this worshiping God according to the dictates of their conscience. So it didn't mean, though, once they got here, that, oh, kumbaya, we're all brothers in Christ and we're all going to be friends and everybody's going to be good and all this. Not so fast. They had different religious beliefs that different parties brought to the country. And several of the colonies actually established official religions. We're going to talk about that shortly. And they were state supported. Virginia, for example, had the Church of England as the state or the colony religion. But there were religious animosities and acrimony and everything else, and people got separated and moved around. And there were people that actually were heavily persecuted, if not put to death, about their religious beliefs. And they went and found some more friendly people to settle among when they found that they weren't so friendly. So that just because they got here and they wanted religious liberty didn't mean that they allowed that, excuse me, to their fellow travelers that had come there. And so really, what we're going to see is that in spite of the fact that they came here for religious liberties, they really brought their own intolerance and persecution in America that had been carried out in Europe. Not nearly as virulently and violently in most instances. However, there were some very unfortunate things that happened in regards to religious liberties. Several of the states still had state-sanctioned religions. At the time the Constitution was signed in 1787. Isn't that interesting? Here we come forward, almost 200 years, and look at that, they still got it. Here's some states with religions, state religions in the 1780s. You can see those 7 states that had those religions that were officially on the books as state-supported religions, okay? They collected taxes in their name in many instances and were able to support that religion. Just think, for example, if you could start a religion, I'm not suggesting you do this, but if you could start a religion and you had the state power behind you to collect taxes, you've got it pretty much made. It's pretty cool. So these were things that those people, I'm not suggesting it to anybody, but the fact of the matter is, that's kind of what was happening. You had state sanction of your religion and you were pretty safe. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson felt like this was a bad approach. I say here, wrong and dangerous. So in 1779, he wrote a bill for establishing religious freedom. It wasn't immediately adopted, and there was a sales pitch that had to go on for a few years, okay? But here's what he wrote at that time in 1779. The opinions of men are not the object of civil government nor under its jurisdiction. So government can't dictate your opinions, unless you're in modern America. But at any rate, we'll get to that. To suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of opinion and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on supposition of their ill tendency is a dangerous fallacy which at once destroys all religious liberty, because he, being, of course, judge of that tendency, will make his opinions the rule of judgment and approve or condemn the sentiments of others only as they shall square with or suffer with his own. So this individual that's making these decisions is ultimately going to rule against you or for you based upon how you conform to his belief system, okay? So, again, roll forward about 7 years, and he was able to get the Virginia legislature to pass what they termed the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, okay? So here's what it's about. Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom is a statement about both freedom of conscience and the principle of separation of church and state. We're going to find out that's a far different definition than normally is attributed to it today. They definitely did not want the state intruding on your opinions or your religion. It was written by Jefferson, passed January 16th, 1786. It was considered to be a forerunner to the First Amendment to protect the religious freedom. Now remember, this is 1786. Constitution was written in 1787, and then 1789, they put out the 12 proposed amendments that included religious liberty. So there's an evolutionary period with all of this too. So the Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists have been trying to get this done for a decade, including the separation of church and state. And Jefferson put forth this statute that disestablished, I probably should have hyphenated that to emphasize it, disestablished the Church of England in Virginia. So the Church of England held ascendancy in religious matters in Virginia until this point. Freedom of religion to people of all religious faiths. And, you know, you say, well, Catholics are of one breed and Jews are another, and then all the Protestants are another. That's basically how they looked at it in those days. Okay, so here's what it says. Be it enacted by General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods. So you can't be taxed for another religion, guys, okay? Nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. So we're going to see this thing happening where you have a right to profess your religion, to speak openly about it, and it's not going to diminish or in any way prevent you from being able to serve in a civil capacity. And we're going to see that these things are incorporated in not only the Constitution, but in the way the First Amendment is written. Now, it's interesting to me, and we're going to get to this in a short period of time, I hope. In 2016, how the U.S. Civil Rights Commission decided, no, we're going to define religious liberty as narrowly as we possible. Just kind of tuck this away in your mind, let it cogitate for a while, and as we get to it in the discussion, you'll start to see how they weasel worded a thing that said basically, right, you can worship in your temples and in your chapels and in your synagogues and in your cathedrals, but don't you dare bring it into the public marketplace. See, they're saying you can worship and practice your religion within the setting. And that couldn't be farther from what the original intent was. And as he says here, all men be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. And they can serve in any official capacity. Okay, so this was a very open-ended kind of thing. And we were a nation that worshiped God and had sober-mindedness. We did not have quite the undertow we've got in today's world, but part of that is in fact that we're being indoctrinated with a false religion constantly. Going on with the Virginia Religious Liberties Act. And though we well know, okay, this is a principle of constitutions and of legislatures. And you got to think about this, but I'll preface it with this little statement. A constitution is binding from legislature to legislature to legislature to legislature. It's something that is not easily changed except by the amendment process, okay? But legislatures are not bound by the previous legislature. They may say, in a stupid rule, that crosswalks only go from this curb to this curb, and that's the only way crosswalks can go. The next legislature isn't bound by that rule. They can say you can cross diagonally. I mean, okay, so this is a stupid thing, I know. But the previous legislature can't prevent the other legislature from doing that, okay? So he's recognizing that you can't bind a future legislature. But if they do change this natural God-given law of freedom of religion, they're violating a natural right. Okay, so listen to what I've got to say here. Well, Jefferson said it much better than I. And though we well know that this assembly, elected by the people for the ordinary purposes of legislation only, have no power to restrain the acts of succeeding assemblies constituted with powers equal to our own, and that therefore to declare this act irrevocable would be of no effect in law. He says, we know we can't tell you, you can't get rid of this. Yet, we are free to declare, and do declare, that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall hereafter be passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right. saying, okay, you idiots that come down the road, if you do this, you're violating God-given rights. And this, by the way, is just exactly what the Civil Rights Commission in 2016 has proposed happen, that they regulate religious liberties to as narrowly as possible their
Hey, Scott, I want to make a comment. You actually could argue that is in the Constitution under the Ninth Amendment.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Ninth Amendment says even if we failed, and this is a very appropriate thing because this was 1786, and the Constitution was written, and they said we don't need a Bill of Rights because we didn't give the national government enough power to hurt any of your rights, but we still want a Bill of Rights. And so they said, okay, fine, in 1789, here's one that says even if we didn't mention any rights, you still have them all. So that's what the Ninth Amendment is. The 10th Amendment puts a period and exclamation point behind that, and it says, if we didn't delegate the authority of the general government, they don't have it. Okay, so all of this stuff is a precursor to what actually went into the Bill of Rights, and to see the continuity of the thought process is important for us. They didn't say it one way one year, and then we're going to change it next year or the next, and pretty soon we had a hodgepodge of ideas. In a little while, just briefly, we're going to talk about the Northwest Ordinance. And you're going to see how it collates with something Jefferson said later about, religious liberty doesn't allow you to do criminal things. So, like mercy killings or honor killings or whatever they call them under Sharia law. It's not allowed. Religious liberty does not extend to religious mistakes, or how shall we say, false traditions. Anyway, so if this future legislature, like is proposed under the Civil Rights Commission, narrows it down and restrains you from the marketplace or anything else, it's a legislative violation of a natural right. Okay, so going on, this thing about the declaration of religious faith shall be unpunished does not give impunity to criminal acts dictated by religious error. Okay, so if you're going to have honor killings, that doesn't apply, because that violates baseline principles of liberty and humanity. Say again? It violates natural law, including life, liberty, and property, stuff like that, Okay, so 1787 rolls around, and the Constitution conventions in Philadelphia through that long, hot summer. During that time that they were meeting in Philadelphia, the Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Okay, so Constitution convention's going on here. Congress is still meeting, and they passed this ordinance of 1787. So basically, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established the rules of engagement for becoming a state of the territories that would be added to the nation. So, like how much critical mass do you have to have in population? Then you got to create a constitution. They did a lot of other things that were really interesting in here, like banning slavery. This was early on their mind. This idea of religious liberty and so on is in here too. But there was another interesting thing I probably just ought to mention and then run on down the road. And that has to do with the treatment of the Native American tribes. And the intention of the American founding fathers was very honorable. They were not to go out and conquer and murder and pillage and plunder and genocidal acts and killing all their food supply so that men, women, and children died, all that kind of stuff. That was absolutely against the original intent of the American founding fathers. We'll have to look at that sometime if you're interested, if we ever do a Northwest Ordinance review. But anyway, rules of engagement, how do you become a state? So, in 1789, after the Constitution was ratified and put into effect, Washington was, he was elected by the Electoral College the 6th of April, and he was inaugurated the 30th of April. Did we mention last time that John Adams, his first vice president, was inaugurated before he was because they needed to constitute the Senate? Okay, so these little interesting twists are kind of fun to play with. Putting this together required a concerted effort to, shall we say, dot the I's and cross the T's, they weren't just wild-eyed, throw mud, let's be done with it and move ahead. There was a reasoned approach to things, very much different than after the Franco-Prussian War, let's just say, where the communist commune took over Paris and ruled it as an international commune. And the stuff they did was absolutely abominable, and they showed they were incapable of governance. The Founding Fathers were exactly the opposite. Okay, so they wanted to make sure that they repassed the Northwest Ordinance in 1789 to make sure that everybody understood this still is in effect under the new Constitution. And it's interesting that you might see it as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 or 1789 or 1787/89, but that's why, because they repassed it in 89. But this was going to be still applied under the new government established in the new Constitution. So we've got to consider again, like Jefferson's, well, I mean, go back to the Mayflower Compact, but Jefferson's Religious Liberties Act in Virginia was a precursor to the Bill of Rights. This was also a precursor to First Amendment, protecting religious liberties. So what happened was that Congress passed proposed amendments. We talked about this last time we were together. After boiling down all of the suggested potential amendments, Congress passed 12 with 2/3 margin and forwarded them on to the states for ratification. They had to ratify with 3/4 margin, according to the constitutional formula outlined. Now, so let's go for just a second and mention the Northwest Ordinance, a couple of articles. And this also goes with what was said at other times by other of the Founding Fathers, including Jefferson. So Article 1 of the ordinance stated, no person demeaning himself in a peaceable and orderly manner. So that could go into the way it said where, criminal acts are not appropriate under the name of religion. So if you're a good person, peaceable and all that kind of stuff, shall ever be molested on account of his mode of worship or religious sentiments in the said territory. So rowdy, riotous, murderous kinds of things are not allowed under the First Amendment or religious liberty. Article 3 says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. We're going to see here shortly what Washington said, what Adams said, and what Jefferson said about these kinds of things. But just that final statement, I have had people argue voraciously that schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged means that they intended to have the federal government involved in education. You might just note, first of all, the Constitution does not mention anything about any role of the general government in education. The first draft of the Constitution in May of 1787 had a federal government role for education, but it was gone by September of 1787. They left it out. They knew it was there because they put it in themselves. In May, they took it out. So it's not in the Constitution, but that doesn't mean they can't have high regard for education. In fact, there's 3 things that Jefferson was most proud of. He had it put on his headstone. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the author of the Virginia Religious Liberty Act, and he was the founder of the Virginia University. But it was not done by the federal government. It was done through private enterprise. Okay, so just because that's there, don't get trapped into the idea that some have taken that, oh, that means that the feds should be involved in education. There's nothing whatsoever you can interpret in any way, shape, or form that delegates that authority to the federal government. That's another interesting side note. So the founders didn't want to have any religious denomination from someday fostering its preeminence in the government. They wanted to prevent all of that from happening. They intended that there should be no state religion established writing in Article 6, this is an interesting thing that I got kind of caught in one time. There shall never be a religious test required in order to hold office in the nation. Some of you know that I was nominated in a national convention for the office of vice president. There are at least 2 states that took my name off of the party's ballot because to them I was not Christian enough. Well, now wait a minute, is that a religious test? Well, it was some pastor's religious test. But that was in violation, and the party that was doing this should have known better based on the name of their party. But at any rate, no religious test. They didn't want that to interfere in religion at all. And it says, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Okay, so you can't say, oh, you're a Jew, you're disqualified, or whatever. It's not to be part of the selection process. Okay, so during the ratification, the states wanted a Bill of Rights. They rejected the idea that the general government was not given enough power to ever violate rights. Nevertheless, we want a Bill of Rights. I'm sure glad they had it because they wanted to vouchsafe this inalienable right to worship according to the dictates of one conscience. Again, they had a pretty good foundation of that. By the time it came to this, meaning this Jeffersonian Virginia Act and the Northwest Ordinance Act, it showed the drift of where the country wanted to go. And they had 150 plus years to kind of sort out their religious acrimony, although it wasn't perfect because even in the 1780s, they still had state-sponsored religions. But nevertheless, they were going in that direction. Okay, so the First Amendment assures that we can have God-given right for freedom of religion, not freedom from religion, and it will be protected and preserved in the nation. Again, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Well, so they declared religious liberty. No intention that government be prohibited from formal recognition of God or adversarial to religion, or that God would be subverted by government action. Okay, so does the First Amendment require the national government to take an adversarial position against public religiosity? Court cases and legislation would say, yes, it does. But let's look at it. So, again, no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Pretty broad brush kind of thing. So what were the original intent of those that created the amendment? Let's look at the facts. Okay, so September 25th, 1789, the United States Congress, House and the Senate, forwarded a proposed Bill of Rights, 12 proposed amendments, to the states for ratification. Okay, remember the Congress had recommended them with 2/3 or more vote, and now it's got to go to the states to be ratified to make it change the Constitution, which would be, the states agreeing that it's going to be included in the Constitution. So remember that date, September 25th. That's the date they forwarded them. They just voted on it. It's well on their mind. This idea of religious liberty was well there on their mind. Well, but it should be adversarial, we're told. Well, that same day, the House passed a resolution requesting President Washington proclaim can you believe it, a national day of thanksgiving and prayer. Those turkeys that just voted for that wanted that National Day of Thanksgiving and Prayer. Can you imagine? And they're demanding the president, well, demands may be an overstatement. They're telling him, Mr. President, this is what the heart and mind of the Congress is at this point. So the very next day, the United States Senate concurred with that. So the Senate and the House that had just approved that what became our First Amendment about religious liberty said we needed a day of national thanksgiving and prayer. So by the 28th of September, a joint resolution of the House and Senate laid before President Washington. So they walked it over to him and said, Mr. President, this is what the House and the Senate is asking you to do. So by the 3rd of October, Washington issued his Thanksgiving proclamation. Okay? So here's what he issued at the direction of Congress. And I really believe, and we just, recently, if you're not watching this a long time later from now, we just recently commemorated Thanksgiving. And this is what, it's a kind of a family requirement in our family that we review this every Thanksgiving. We should review it more often, I know. You could read this in your most sacred meetings that you hold, and it would be perfectly appropriate. So here's what he wrote. Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor, and whereas both houses of Congress have, by their joint committee, requested me to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many and signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be, that we may then all unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and protection of the people of this country previously to their becoming a nation, for the signal and manifold mercies and the favorable interpositions of his providence in the course and conclusion of the late war, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have of acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general for all the great and various favors which he has been pleased to confer upon us, and also that we may then unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions, to enable us all, whether in public or private stations, to perform our several and relative duties properly and punctually, to render our national government a blessing to all the people by constantly being a government of wise, just, and constitutional laws, discreetly and faithfully executed and obeyed, to protect and guide all sovereigns and nations, especially such as have shown kindness to us, and to bless them with good governments, peace, and concord, to promote the knowledge and practice of true religion and virtue, and the increase of science among them and us, and generally to grant unto all mankind such a degree of temporal prosperity as he alone knows to be best. Signed the 3rd day of October, 1789. Yes, ma'am.
So this is how the Pilgrims established.
No, there was, okay, that's a good question. I'll repeat it for the people out in the etherland. There have been numerous other Thanksgiving days proclaimed, and even back in the 1600s. So this was not the original only day they did this, because there were other days of national thanksgiving and prayer that got them through the Revolutionary War. These people were a very highly religious people. The level of religiosity in the beginning of this nation cannot be overstated, I don't believe. You know, there were three, if you will, mortal men that they used their words often in, you know, Blackstone and Montesquieu and Locke, when the founding fathers were establishing things. The fourth, and by far and away more prominent presentation in all of their statements, were scriptures. Very often they quoted Blackstone, Montesquieu, and Locke when they were quoting scriptures. So the overwhelming amount of scriptural and religious overtures, oh man, I threw out so much when we were coming to this, but I'm glad you brought the question up so we can start talking about this. When the kids were taught to read, you know, the A is for apple, B is for ball kind of thing that we do and see Dick and Jane run, or whatever they did in my day. Nowadays it's probably something else that's a less understood principle. But anyway, all of the alphabet was tied to scriptures. Everything, when you learned A was for Adam, you know, I mean, they incorporated scriptures into the entire alphabet. The primer that was put together by the Pilgrim Puritans absolutely incorporated religion into education. So every step of the way. And they had prayers that changed the tempests against the British fleet. I mean, so this was something after the formation of the nation under the Constitution. And by golly, it was a Thanksgiving thing again for middle of November or the end of November. And it collates pretty closely to what we do now. But no, there were many others previous to this. And so the religiosity of the people overwhelmingly could be measured. So good question, because no, this wasn't the first time it popped into their mind. We've been living this for a couple of centuries, almost by the time they got there. Okay, so Washington brought this. Now, I will say that if there were no other evidence than this particular example of the Bill of Rights being passed, the House and the Senate then requiring a day of Thanksgiving and prayer, the president putting it out, I mean, if there were no other evidence than that of the fact that there is not to be a religious animosity, this would have to suffice for, I think, anybody that has a reasonable mind. So anyway, that came out of the Congress that just passed the Bill of Rights. Okay, so there was never a national religion that was to be established or supported through government, or was to be given preeminence through some kind of government mandate. We've all been through mandates with the face diapers and the social distancing and all this kind of stuff. No, there was no declaration without a law. There was nothing at any point that said this national government supports this conduct. So the founding fathers had different religions. There's no question about that. And to see, they came from different states, and we had 7 of them that actually had state religions in the time the Constitutional Convention was being put together. But they built upon a common belief in a God who established and upheld this nation. As I said earlier, overarching, undergirding everything that came about in this nation was the hand of God. You know, we're going to see how far we've strayed. I very truncated this part because of time, and it might have to do even worse. But George Washington, in his farewell address, said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. Okay, what's that? Religion and morality. Okay, going on. These firmest props of the duties of men and citizens, the mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. I find it interesting that he separated the politician from pious people. I don't know if it was completely appropriate in his day, but even a crass politician ought to be able to remember this. Okay, a volume could not trace their connections with private and public felicity. That's where you can have your peace of heart and mind. Okay, then he goes on to say, let it be simply asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are instruments of investigation in courts of justice? Okay, I just will parenthetically again remark, what happens when you go to testify? You take an oath. And he said, you know, how can we believe people before the courts if they don't believe in God? Okay, and there's an instance that Tocqueville documented when he was here in the country in the 1830s. When he was touring the country, he went to a court in New York, and a guy that was an avowed atheist. I don't believe in God, but I want to testify. The judge wouldn't let him. Said, well, how are we going to believe you? You know, if you trick us, you don't think you'll be a penalty. No, you can't testify. And that's how seriously they took this. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. So this religious concept was ingrained right in our very government. And then he went on to say, it is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. It's a popular government. It's where we vote for people to hold office. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric. Promote then as an object of primary importance, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge, in proportion as the structure of government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. Well, also in the farewell address, he talked of our common heritage. Even though we had many, many different sects of religion in the government at that time, or in our communities and states, this is what he said. Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation, any name, derived from local discriminations. No, I'm a Virginian. Well, no, you're an American, but yeah, you live in Virginia. In his day, state and regional, shall we say it, identification was in many ways more powerful than the national identity at this point. But then he makes this interesting observation. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. So even if you're a Episcopalian or a Baptist or whatever, your baseline beliefs are pretty well aligned, okay? And let's go on to the second president of the United States, John Adams. I mean, we could go through these all at great length, but we're just going to have to, in the interest of time. Our Constitution was designed only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And my wife keeps saying, why doesn't the Constitution work? Well, moral and religious people, how do we qualify? So anyway, there's a lot of room for criticism at this time, because it'll only work for moral and religious people. It's not going to work for anything else. Just after Jefferson had been elected, before he took office, the Danbury Baptists of Connecticut wrote him a letter. They were concerned about some things, and this wall of separation letter came from that. Okay, now the wall of separation letter was simply a recognition that there could be no national religion. Nobody could take preeminence by government edict or directive or legislation. But a lot of people have said, oh, Jefferson said, wall of separation. Don't you ever cross that. Religion and government can't be mixed. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding that's happened. So Jefferson got the letter from the Danbury Baptists, and they expressed concern that they had heard rumors that another religion was poised to become the national religion. Now, how would you feel? You're a Baptist, and suddenly Episcopalians are going to be in charge. I mean, I'm just picking two names. I'm not saying bad things about either. But the point of the matter is, you're going, what is going on? Okay. So Jefferson assured them it was impossible for any particular sect of religion to be placed in a position of preeminence in the nation. Now, remember, this is 1802 when the letter came out. And when did the ratification of the First Amendment happen? It was officially ratified the 15th of December, 1791. So it's been over 10 years that should have been well understood in the nation. So we got to assure that we'll be devoted to the full protection of religious freedom in the nation, just like it was originally. And we are indeed in danger of losing our God-given gift of worship, according to the dictates of our conscience, and the establishment of a de facto civil religion, as in, well, that's how we do business in this country. Everybody knows that. Okay. So a civil religion is a dogma, a faith-based dogma that's emblazoned with the power and insignia of the state. Okay, now back on, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but there was a time under Constantine and forward that if you could be emblazoned with the power of the state, you had more power as a priest than a soldier or a governor or a senator or whatever. The state ruled supreme. The state became a tyrant, and the Inquisitions are vast testimony of that. So, yes, ma'am. That means you got the label, woman, you're in charge because you're whatever the civil religion is, okay? And you got to tell princes, or princesses, whatever. You got to tell monarchs what to do and be. The Pope ruled supreme over all monarchs. So the state held as much power as the religion allowed, but no more. That's what it was, and I'm hearkening back to the days after Constantine when it became the official state religion. But we have a state religion today. It's tax supported, and by the way, if you don't think so, look at your property tax. A lot of people pay their property tax at the end of the year, and the problem is the vast majority of our property tax, which just went up this year again, surprise, surprise, the vast majority goes to a state-sponsored religion called the public education system. And the public education system is hundreds of billions of dollars in this nation that is tax provided. And it is interesting, well, it's called secular humanism, the religion they teach there. We'll talk just briefly about that. But secular humanism is what is taught there. And if you haven't read the Humanist Manifesto 1, Humanist Manifesto 2, and Humanist Manifesto 3, 1933, 73, and 2003, they're little brief pamphlets. You could read them in an hour sitting there, reading them all together. It's easy. But if you can read those and in your heart of hearts tell me that isn't the de facto lesson plan of America, you probably ought to reread them. Anyway, so virtually all of my property tax goes to the public school, secular humanistic religion, and try not paying it. Goes to support your public schools. It is. What's being taught there is a faith-based system that is without a God. We'll talk about that in just a second. I can't. Oh, I like it. I like your attitude. Yes. No, I didn't say that. I said if you try doing that, the big hammer is going to come down on your head, and within 3 years, you lose your property. Most areas. I don't know what they're all at. Did you have something?
Just that secular humanism worships self.
Okay.
Instead of as God.
We're going to take just a few statements out of the manifestos. You've got to get them. This is not a discussion of secular humanism per se. It's based on a religion thing. My beef against this is it is a state-sponsored religion that you must pay. Okay? And this, yeah, well, I like your attitude more all the time. So anyway, I've got some statements out of Humanist Manifesto 1933, which was signed by John Dewey, who's considered the father of modern American education. If you don't know anything about Dewey, this guy was a religious humanist, and they put together this manifesto, and I've got a whole chapter in my book that that reviews the Humanist Manifesto. They're very, very brief, but they are the lesson. They're the bullet points of a lesson plan for everything that's in the modern American education system. So there's about 36, I think, that signed it total. The Humanist Manifesto in 1933. So let's review a few of the things. And you can compare and contrast in your own mind. Okay, is this what's in the public education system? I think you'll have to admit that it is. But I'm old enough to remember we prayed every morning in school. And, people say, oh, you can't do that. You're going to put a kid in, they'll have a collapse if a Catholic boy had to get up and say a prayer in front of a bunch of Mormons, or a Jewish boy had to do it in front of a bunch of Catholics, or whatever. It was shall I say, a cultural experience. We got to know each other's belief system better. We didn't judge each other. Oh, that's how Catholics pray. That's the way it was. But that was stopped in 1961. We don't need to go off on this tangent because this isn't the basis of our discussion tonight, but you needed to know that we have a national religion, state-sponsored, state-supported, tax-supported by the force of arms. And it's really a tragic thing. So here's what they say. This is out of the Manifesto 1. The time has come for widespread recognition of the radical changes in religious beliefs throughout the modern world. In order that religious humanism, they call it that themselves. I didn't have to make this up, okay? I can't make up things as egregious as they do. May be better understood, in order that religious humanism may be better understood, we, the undersigned, these are the 36 guys or so that signed it, desire to make certain affirmations which we believe the facts of our contemporary life demonstrate. And they go on, there's about 14 points they make. I'm just taking little snippets of them. Religious humanists, again, their terminology, I didn't make this up, regard the universe as self-existing and not created. There is no creator. Are you kidding me? What evidence do you have of that? What evidence do you have that it wasn't created? They're all in, I mean, it's like, we're all knowing. We don't see the evidence, so it doesn't exist, right? Okay, so there is no creator. This is fundamental to the education system in America. Humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. Oh, so Darwin was right. I bet you. I've heard that in the education system. Religious humanism, again, their term, considers the complete realization of human personality to be the end of man's life and seeks its development and fulfillment in the here and now. This is the explanation of the humanist's social passion. I have a very good friend. I had a very good friend until yesterday afternoon when he died. Very unexpectedly to all of us, and it's a sad thing, but you know what? I think Mike still lives, you know? Anyway, so not a lot of commentary there too, but no, with these guys, no, it's all done. When I was younger, in my teenage years, you got to grab all the gusto you can get. Do you remember that beer commercial? Anyway, some of you might. But at any rate, you know, hey, it's all it is, baby. It's all in now. And then we consider the religious forms and ideas of our fathers no longer adequate. So this is the fundamental belief system. And they teach the mechanics of reproduction and so on, but nothing about fidelity and honor and character and all this. We could get into hours of this. Again, there's a chapter in my book about religion and freedom. Okay, so this de facto religion worships the wisdom of man and rejects the gods of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, it also promotes the concept that the welfare state will take care of you if we comply with their policies and procedures. So all you need to do is you go on bended knee. Maybe you don't even have to bend your knee. You fill out the right form at the right window, and you get food stamps or housing, or you get some kind of beneficent thing like a student grant or something like that. All sorts of things are handed out. All you got to do is go ask and fill out the right form, okay? And by golly, in fact, what I may do, I'm going to have to see what we do with this next thing, the next get-together. I'm going to try and do part 2 here. Because I've been talking fast, we may actually get through part 1. You've missed a lot, though, I got to tell you. There's a lot of backstory on all of these things. Yeah, it's a 50,000 feet flyover. At any rate, we got to talk about hypersonic missiles one of these days, too. Has nothing to do with our discussion today. But just based on some of these, then I'm not sure America has any. I'll just say this. Hypersonic missiles normally will carry multiple capacities of payloads. They can be nukes or they can be conventional, okay? They fly between 10 and 15 Mach. So just to tell you how fast this will happen, you know where Denver is? It's a little drive from here, 500 miles. Between Denver and Salt Lake would take, depending on the speed they're running at, between 3 and 5 minutes. And they're really hard to defend against. And we're a nation that I don't believe has a capacity of that yet, but Russia, China, Iran do. And I know that they're not in a great abundance. But this is just to show you the high risk we are in right now. And we need to recognize that we got to turn our heart back to God. I'll just turn it back to the class this way. But if we think that, oh, by golly, somebody launches against one of our buddies, we'll show them what our response is. Look at the misery we're going to cause for everybody.
It's all going to be Ukraine.
Yeah, that's the thing. Some people are saying we can rearm Ukraine very quickly as soon as Trump gets in office, but here's the problem. Our arsenals are empty. our 155 millimeter artillery rounds, we are 8 years behind on that. We can't even meet current requirements for annual training with our military folks on using that armament. So we're way behind the curve. All of this stuff has been happening while the nation slept. But let me just say one other thing about these hypersonic missiles. If they're carrying a payload of 8 different delivery packages, I don't care if they're nukes or conventional or whatever, if that missile was able to get between Denver and Salt Lake, just to show you the distances traveled in 3 to 5 minutes, and spread its payload out, we could have one delivered to North Salt Lake, one to Bountiful, one to Centerville, one to Farmington, one to Layton, and one to Kaysville. You could have one on each of those, whether it's a nuke or a conventional. Right there too. So they would be a natural target. But the point is, I'm not sure we've got any of these, and we do know that these other countries do. Not in great proliferation, but enough to be a deterrent, I think. So the welfare state's going to take care of us if we go fill out the right form. You can go to college on Pell Grants or whatever. All of this violates the Establishment Clause found in the First Amendment. It is a national de facto religion, a civil religion. So, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. We have established that religion as our de facto religion, or prohibiting the free exercise. If somebody wants to worship at the altar of the humanist, I don't care, but don't make me pay for it. Yes, ma'am.
Property tax that I'm paying right now goes toward that school.
Okay, go look at your property tax. You'll get a little form that says, here's who gets what. You know, you might have one department that gets this, and there may be something that gets that. But the vast majority, I would say 2/3 to 3/4 of mine, I don't remember the numbers exactly, 2/3 to 3/4 of my virtually $4,000 a year rent that I pay to live in my house, 2/3 to 3/4 of it goes to the public education system, to bonds they have collected and to operation of the schools and all. Go back and look at it. You'll be even madder than you are now. Roughly. Yeah. I don't want everybody to get into a argument about this, but I pay more than you do. But I will say this about that. Many years ago, our family got transferred from Bountiful, Utah to New Jersey. My property tax that year in Bountiful was $515. Okay. I got to New Jersey, it was immediately $2,400. A few months later, it went to $4,000. And by the time I'd said I've had enough of this and moved out, it went to $6,000. Okay. I was telling some guys this at a national political convention, grumbling about how bad New Jersey was, and they both started laughing. One of them was from Massachusetts and the other one's from New York. The one guy from, I don't remember which state it was, said mine's 12,000. And the other guy says mine's 15,000. So these are over $1,000 a month you're paying to live in your house, even if it's paid for. And the vast majority of that goes to the public education. Anyway, all right. So go look at that, and I think you'll find you got a lot more to be ticked off about. Okay. Religious liberties vouchsafe in the nation. It's our obligation to keep that going and for ourselves and our posterity. And this is an interesting concept. Oh, you're not a big enough religion to really worry about. You know, you only have 6 members, or you only have 700,000 or whatever. What is a critical mass for a religion before it's officially sanctioned? It doesn't matter. Here's what Jefferson said. He's the guy that wrote this Religious Liberty Act. He says, I am a sect by myself as far as I know. And you know what? He probably was. I know, I've read Jefferson and Adams' reconciliation letters after they had both served in the presidency. Magnificent letters. They talked about the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They said it was soon, in their opinion, and that they hoped that they would live to see it, but doubted it because of their age. They worried that the gospel of Christ had been modified, their term, priestcrafts, The people spun religion in favor of whatever they wanted to believe. And it's very interesting to me. They founding fathers coined the term priestcraft, and they've coined the term secret combinations, which we use today without a full understanding of the scope of it. Jefferson had a book that he had put together that had in columns, it was only the words of Christ from the New Testament, only, nothing else, no other extraneous anythings, and they were in the original languages. And every night he read that book, not cover to cover, obviously, in the original languages before he went to sleep. His family did not know he did this until after he died. They found the book in the drawer in his nightstand. And he just wanted the plain, simple, straightforward, just the facts, ma'am, words of Christ, okay? And so he thought he was a sect all by himself. But both Jefferson and Adams predicted, if you will, in their letters, the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ in its true form. It's interesting to me that they both died July 4th, 1826. Kind of an interesting thing to think about, at any rate. So Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, he said that he was not inclined to, be bigoted against these other religious beliefs, even though they didn't go along with his. In his first inaugural address, he said, "I deem one of the essential principles of our government, and consequently one which ought to shape its administration, equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political." Okay, so he wasn't going to, unless it was criminal activity, resist it in the name of religion. Okay, so here's what he said in his 1786 Religious Liberty Act. Almighty God, we said this earlier, but just think about it in context of everything we've talked about, hath created the mind free and manifested his supreme will, that free it shall remain, by making it altogether insusceptible of restraints. Be it therefore enacted that no man shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. You couldn't be prohibited from holding office because you weren't Christian enough. Okay. So in political correctness, we're assaulting that today. Okay. Now, I give as an example, and I'm probably going to have to not read as carefully as I would the statements out of this 296-page report. I've only got 296 pages left to go. No, you guys know I wouldn't do that to you, would I? Anyway, it was issued in September of 2016 under the Obama regime, okay? So it was a conference that was held in Washington, D.C. that month. It is titled, you can tell by the short title, it's going to be interesting, Peaceful Coexistence, Reconciling Non-Discrimination Principles with Civil Liberties, a Briefing Before the United States Commission on Civil Rights. That's the title of this document. You can find it. Government Printing Office has it if you want to buy a 296-page document. Okay, so again, we go back to the First Amendment that you can't prohibit the free exercise of religion, okay? And then in 1993, you're going to find, this is a very interesting thing. How many of you know Chuck Schumer? You've heard of Chuck. You've also heard of Ted Kennedy. They were trying, through a legislative enactment, to protect the First Amendment back in 1993. It's very interesting. Schumer was in the Congress and Kennedy was in the Senate. They issued a joint, well, the same day they each put the identical bills into their respective House. So it was intended to ensure that interests in religious freedom are protected. Okay, and then this was March 11th that it came out with Schumer and Kennedy that did it. It passed the House unanimously, and it was nearly unanimous in the Senate. There were 3 senators that did not vote for it. One was from Tennessee, and I can't think of his name right now. And then there was Helms and Byrd. Those 3 senators were the only ones of the 100 senators that voted against it. So it was nearly unanimous there too. They wanted to protect the First Amendment because they could see encroachments, okay? And Bill Clinton signed it into law, okay? Absolutely, it was veto proof, okay? Okay, so, yes, ma'am. Existed. It's a Department of Redundancy Department. Is that what you're saying? We already have religious liberty. It really was unnecessary. And while I don't know well, the problem is they want to narrowly define that Religious Liberties Act. This is what the guy that ran the Civil Rights Commission, his name is Castro. I don't know if he's any relation to somebody that lived in Cuba. But the fact of the matter is, in a way, by offering to protect it, they put it at risk because it was put it at risk because weasel words always get in there, you know, and they're going to say, well, no, not so fast. Well, we have this idea, like the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. How much more clearly can that be stated? Okay, but there was, I'm trying to give them honorable intentions on it to say they were trying because it was being eroded and they could see it being eroded clear back in 93. Okay, so after it was passed in 93, it was declared unconstitutional in 97 in the states. So this was an example where they said the general government cannot enforce upon the states a Religious Freedom Act. Okay. What did I just hear earlier in this meeting about some kind of corporate reporting responsibility that's being enforced upon the state? I don't know. It's so inconsistent. But in a way, it was consistent in the fact that when the First Amendment first came out, there was these 7 states that had these religious, you know, declarations of their state religions. And it didn't say, oh, you guys got to get rid of that. It just put it out there, and the state said, oh, we understand better now, and they got rid of it on their own. Okay, so that's kind of what happened with that, and I think they were hearkening back to the fact that it wasn't going to be tamped down the throats of the states. But they did declare it unconstitutional in the application to the states in 1997. It still applies to the federal government, but 21 states have passed some kind of that same Religious Freedom Act that applies to state governments and local municipalities. So about half the states have said, okay, we get it. We're going to also protect religious liberties. Interesting to me. Here's what it said. Governments shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability. So even though it applies, you know, that the government has passed this law, we're going to still let everybody practice the religion the way they want. That's what the act said. But there was some exceptions. It was necessary for the furtherance of a compelling government interest. This is a real broad thing. How do you say, oh, yours is compelling and yours isn't? Okay, so that they suddenly started getting these weasel concepts there. But it said it had to, the compelling interest had to relate directly to core constitutional issues. So religious belief systems shouldn't be able to interfere with the right to keep and bear arms. They're not competing, they're collaborative, okay? The second condition, the rule must be be the least restrictive way to which to further the government interest. So they couldn't get the big baseball bat out, they had to beat you with something a little less. But those were some of the exceptions. But this 296-page report, it was issued in September of 2016, again, held in Washington, titled that. We've reviewed much of this. Okay, I'm just going to probably read the underlined portion, but you really ought to read every little word in it, because these are quotes. You'll note that they're all quotations out of the this civil rights document. And I give you a kind of interpretation at the bottom of either one of these. Religious exemptions from non-discrimination laws and policies must be weighed carefully and defined narrowly on a fact-specific basis. I say these are weasel words inferring the need to limit religious liberty. Okay, so let's say you don't want to have people of a made-up sexual status that are required to be put into leadership positions in your church, okay? Okay, so weigh them carefully and make sure that it's fact basis. So this can open up a lot of doors. But the way most religions, including the predominant religion in this state, have chosen to basically support these kinds of things as long as they're exempted within that religious institution. So you can't be forced to put a bishop in that's of some made-up sexual status, okay? Because they, within their chapels, can run their religion the way they want. But you as an individual that may not want to rent to somebody that has a perverse kind of way of living their lives, you can't be, yeah, it's just like, no, you've got to. I mean, you're an individual, you're not an institution. And that's where the institutions have been throwing their congregants under the bus, I guess is the best way to put it. So if we're going to discriminate, you got to have a narrowly defined fact-specific basis. Next one, federal and state courts, lawmakers, and policymakers at every level must tailor religious exceptions to civil liberties that they made up, that the government made up, okay? Whether it's because of color or gender or socioeconomic status, whatever, that they're protecting this particular thing and created and made, shall we say, rights for them. Did you have a comment?
I've just seen the word narrowly, and it's like, these should be broad because they're rights, and they're just trying to.
Well, that's exactly where I'm going with this, is what they're trying to do is taking a broad brush thing about our ability to worship according to the dictates, and they're saying, oh no, you can do this in your temples and in your chapels and in your synagogues and in your cathedrals, but don't you dare try to bring this to the public market. And that's where they're going with this. Religious liberty should not get in the way of government-created mandates. So if they create a mandate that you will offer this right to somebody, don't try and get in the way of that. Government did it. Okay, it does not limit others' freedom from government-imposed religious limitations under the Establishment Clause. Okay, so they're going to be able to legislate to mandate a broad spectrum of things that were previously excluded. So they're capturing you. Okay.
Thank you.
See, yeah, you got sick of the whole story, I think. Okay. Okay. So they're talking about these things only being, okay. So it says, I'm going to not just read the underlined part. This act creates First Amendment free exercise clause rights only for individuals and religious institutions, only to the extent that they do not unduly burden all of these newly created civil rights liberties that they've done for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. So they're going to ruin the First Amendment. Okay. Not unduly, again, this last couple of lines, not unduly burden civil liberties and civil rights with status-based discrimination, okay? States must comply with this commission's usurpations. And then here's what Martin Castro said as the commission chairman. The phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any other form of intolerance. So they're going to say, you can believe anything you want as long as it goes along with what our politically correct view is. So our society is becoming more secular. Fewer and fewer people see religion as important or worth protecting, and you can see that because our education system, since at least the 1930s, has been focused on removing that religious understanding. They're just reinterpreting to say religious freedom means freedom to worship. You can go to your church and do what you want, but don't you dare bring this into the public market. So there's other created emerging rights that are being greater priority, and the law begins to follow the cultural drift which we're creating with our public indoctrination system that is tax supported, okay? So they wanted to overthrow by a legislative enactment the basis of what the First Amendment really says and has been in practice for 235 years. And remember, constitutions are paramount to the statutes or laws enacted by the legislature, limiting and controlling its power. So they want to do with the legislative enactment to overthrow something that's in our Constitution. And remember that the definition during the American founding era constitutions, it was paramount or superior to, eminent of the highest order, the chief, highest rank or order. The Constitution is the highest rank or order. You cannot change it by legislative enactment. Okay. Yes, sir.
Secular humanism have a space to expand to say that it supersedes our rights?
Well, it would be very easily understood that because, you know, by golly, guns are dangerous. It's an emergency. We've got an emerging problem, much like a pandemic. I'm going to tell you how they're going to spin this. Like a pandemic where society is being threatened by an overabundance of guns, and therefore we need to limit them. And I don't care what the Second Amendment says. This is really too important. So our rights economically, our rights to move about, and everything that happened that were taken away in the COVID con could be reenacted over another emergency, and guns could be one of them. So you can see how this belief system could supersede it all. But what I'm saying here is that legislative actions can't supersede or override a constitution. And then next time we get together, we're going to talk about religious liberty and what is the risk if we lose it. So that's our next get together to do part 2. And what I may do, depending on how time goes, I may share a story with you that has haunted me since 1963. And I used to send the story out with my Christmas cards. That's how I wanted everybody to be haunted, and how a nation lost its liberty based upon weasel words and spin and the way things are presented. And if we have time next time, I may go through that little story with you. It takes about 20 minutes, so we'll just see how our time goes. I'm thinking we're pretty full with stuff now. I'll have to see how I can whittle it down. But that's it for today, and we went not that much over, Enoch, so I think we did pretty good with it being on fast forward.
You did great. Thank you. Yeah, you did great on time, and I was thinking we're gonna have to go to 10 o'clock to say what you wanted to say, but that worked out. Definitely. So thank you again, everyone. It's always give a little plug here. We had a great turnout online on our various channels, somewhere around 45 to 50 at the most, right? Kind of coming in and out. So that's good. We hope some of you online come and join us in person if you can, depending where you are. But the reason we study this, the reason we need to preserve this knowledge so we can apply it. And that's why we published this book, the American Committees Association Manual. And it is a step-by-step process on things you might want to try to do to organize with your neighbors, to organize an institution that can preserve liberty, and what actions you can take. And so if you're wondering, what can I do? And you're tired of the other organizations in the world you've tried things and they don't seem to go anywhere, or everyone sells out, start your own and lead the way. And how do you do that? That's what this manual is all about. And we have mentorship for that once a month. We have a Tuesday evening meeting where we talk nationally, and different committees share with each other what they do, and we just study. But mostly you have to lead in your own community, and so we mentor you along the way. So and then I think that's about it. So we'll look forward to next week. Do subscribe to our mailing list. The link is always the same. You can go to committees.us/bootcampmonthly or defendingutah.org/bootcampmonthly. And please consider becoming a member as well if you'd like to get further invites and have that mentorship. So thank you for coming, and thank all you guys for coming. See you next time.
You'll ask folks if they want